The Marith diplomatic residence ran on a schedule that most of its staff would have called civilized. Breakfast service at 7. The morning briefing at 8. Diplomatic sessions in the Grand Hall from 9 until 2, with a catered lunch at noon that cost more per head than I earned in a week. The junior attachés had their own dining room on the East Wing's second floor. The senior envoys had suites on the upper levels with views of the Arath Range turning gold in the morning light, and those suites had their own climate management, and their own calling systems, and their own miniaturized care protocols that we on the service staff were expected to understand and operate invisibly, which is to say without being noticed. I had the pre-dawn shift. That was by my own choosing, and had been for 11 of my 30 years at Marith. 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. The residence was quiet at 5, which suited me. The hallways on the lower service level smelled of floor wax and old stone, and the particular stillness that comes when a building holds its breath between one day and the next. I knew which steps creaked. I knew which corridor lights flickered in the third quarter hour after the backup system cycled. I knew where the heating vents ran warm under the tile, and where the cold came up from the foundations in the Arath winter, and I knew which of those warm patches the residence cat had claimed years before the cat itself had died, and left the warm patches unclaimed and slightly melancholy. I knew which cleaning supplies worked on the particular composite marble that lined the diplomatic reception corridor, and which ones left a haze that you would not notice at ground level, but that showed itself under the chandeliers during evening sessions in a way that the senior staff would notice and mention. That is the kind of knowledge you accumulate when you keep the same rooms clean for 30 years. It is not glamorous knowledge. It is not the kind of thing that gets written in a personnel file or earns a commendation from the residence director. But it is the knowledge that keeps a building running quietly, and on the morning that everything changed, it was exactly what I had. My name is de Savorn. I was 56 that year. I had been married once briefly to a man who had wanted a very different kind of life than the one I kept, and the parting had been civil if not warm, and I bore him no particular ill will, and assumed the reverse was true. I had no children. Most of my acquaintances rather than friends worked the same building I did. My closest friend in the residence was Maid, who ran the morning kitchen prep, and our friendship consisted largely of early morning conversations over the surplus containers before the diplomatic household woke, which sounds meager and was, in fact, quite good. I had a friend who worked the Compact's Arath embassy, name of Paris, whom I saw 3 or 4 times a year when our schedules permitted. I had a neighbor with a dog who I had walked twice when the neighbor was ill, which the neighbor considered a foundation of lasting debt, and I considered a Tuesday. I am not telling this story to make myself interesting. I am telling it because I was the one who was there, and because the things I did were not interesting, they were ordinary, and it matters, I think, that you understand how ordinary they were before you understand what they came to mean. He arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of the Arath autumn, when the mornings had gone cold enough that I had switched from the light cotton uniform to the lined one, and the floor wax took longer to dry because the stone held the cold longer at that hour. I came around the corner of the lower service corridor at 20 minutes past 5, pulling my trolley, the older one, with the wheel that needed a half-turn of correction on the left whenever I was pulling it straight, which was a thing I had done so many times it was no longer a conscious action. And he was simply there, in the alcove at the end of the hall where the residents used to store surplus furniture before we cleared it for equipment space during the previous administration's renovation project. He was big. That is the first thing to say, and I may as well say it plainly because there is no describing the Veth Compact's warrior caste without saying it first. He filled the alcove, not in the way that a piece of furniture fills a space, but in the way that a living thing fills a space when it is too large for it and has settled into it anyway out of necessity, with the particular patience of something that has learned that the space it is given is generally smaller than the space it needs. His haunches were on the floor and his front legs were folded and his head was lowered on its long neck, until the line of his jaw was nearly level with the top of my trolley. His scales were dark, a deep copper gray that looked almost brown in the low service corridor light, ridged heavily along the spine and the line of the jaw, smooth and close set on the lower neck and the broad chest. His wings were folded against his sides, or one of them was. The other hung at an odd angle, the trailing edge scarred in a way that made the folding incomplete, a gap of several handspans where the wing membrane had been torn and healed without the structure it needed to close properly. The scar tissue there had the tight, dry look of an old wound that had received adequate medical attention in the immediate aftermath and insufficient attention in everything that followed. His eyes were open. They had been open, I thought, for some time before I arrived. They were the amber gold of old resin, clear and steady, and they tracked me from the moment I came around the corner. I stopped because you stop when something that large is suddenly in your corridor and you did not know it was coming. I looked at him. He looked at me. He did not move. There was a placard on the wall above the alcove, the kind the residents used for temporary room assignments during diplomatic sessions. It had a name on it in the Veth script, which I could not read, and below that in the common tongue, KORRATH ASSIGNED Lower East Service Corridor, Alcove 3, MARRETH Administrative Placement, Session 14. Session 14 was the Inter-Sovereignty Summit that would run for 6 weeks beginning the following Monday. The residents had housed diplomatic support staff in the service level before, in the smaller rooms near the east stair, but not in the alcoves, and not like this. I looked at the placard for a moment, then I looked at him again. "Good morning," I said, because it was morning and there was a person in my corridor, and that is what you say. He did not respond. His eyes moved, tracking the trolley, then back to me. I went around him and started on the far end of the corridor, because that is where I always started, and his being there was not a reason to change the order. I was aware of him behind me as I worked, not in an alarming way, in the way that you are aware of something large and quiet that is paying attention to what you do, not with judgment, just with the focus of something that has very little else to attend to. When I came back past the alcove on my return pass, I slowed. His eyes followed me again. The wounds under the scarred wing were not well tended. I could see that clearly at close range. The old scar tissue of the wing itself was healed, but there were newer abrasions along the ribs on that side, the kind that come from lying on hard floors without adequate bedding, and the leading edge of the wing joint where the scar tissue pulled tight showed the dry gray of skin that had not been moistened or treated in some time. There was no bedding in the alcove. There was nothing in the alcove at all, in fact, beyond the dragon and the floor and the cold coming up from the foundation stone. I am not a veterinarian or a physician. I had worked around the occasional Veth diplomatic escort over the years, and I knew what healthy looked like and what this looked like, and this did not look healthy. I finished my corridor and brought the trolley back to the supply room and clocked my pass. Then, because it was not yet 7 and the kitchen opened at 6:30, I went to the kitchen and asked Merritt, who ran the morning prep, whether there was surplus from the previous evening. There was always surplus from diplomatic dinners. The question was whether anyone had claimed it, and generally no one had, because the kitchen surplus protocols required a request form, and the request form required a supervisor's countersignature, and most people did not think kitchen surplus was worth a form and a countersignature. I had long since established with Merritt that for the purposes of the Lower East Corridor's informal provisioning arrangement, we would skip the form. Merritt gave me a look over the edge of the cold storage door. "You taking scraps home, Dissa?" "I'm not," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, reading the situation with the efficiency of someone who has been running a kitchen since before most of the current staff were hired. "The big one in the Lower East?" "Yes." She set down what she was holding and went to the back of the cold storage. She came out with a covered basin, braised greens and grain from the previous night's reception, a preparation that the diplomatic kitchen made in sufficient quantity that there was always more than the guests could manage, and always less paperwork about what happened to the remainder than there strictly should have been. Enough to fill a medium-serving bowl twice over. She set it on the counter without ceremony and slid it toward me. "Don't tell Rennet," she said. "Rennet was the residence director, and don't make a habit of it." "I won't make a habit of promising not to make a habit of things," I said, which was as honest as I could be about it. Merritt made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to her prep. I carried the basin to the lower east corridor and set it on the floor outside the alcove without ceremony, without comment, without making any production of it at all. I set it down and went back to my other work. He ate it, I know, because the basin was empty and clean when I collected it at the end of my shift. The floor around it was unscuffed. He had been careful. That was the first day. By the end of the first week, I had established that Korath would eat the surplus if I brought it. Braised greens, grain, the heavy root preparations that came out of the diplomatic kitchen in quantities that always exceeded what the guests could manage. The occasional rack of something that Merritt couldn't justify keeping another day and couldn't justify discarding without at least giving it an opportunity to be useful. He ate whatever I brought, methodically and without ceremony, and he left the basin in the same place I had set it, which I appreciated because it meant I could collect it on my standard pass without adjusting my route. He did not speak to me for the first 9 days. I did not press him. I said good morning when I came around the corner each day because that was what you said, and I worked my corridor, and if I happened to pass near the alcove I did not slow or stare. I was aware of him. He was aware of me. That was the full extent of it those first days, and it was not uncomfortable. I had worked in buildings long enough to know that not every presence required conversation, and that the value of simply being consistent, of showing up in the same way, at the same time, and doing the same thing, is something that reveals itself slowly rather than announcing itself. On the 10th day he said, "You are the same one." I had been mopping the far end of the corridor, and I straightened and looked back. He had not moved from his position in the alcove, but his head was lifted to its full height on the long neck, and he was looking at me directly for the first time in a way that felt different from the amber tracking of the previous 9 mornings. More deliberate, more like the beginning of a conversation than the observation of one. "I work this corridor every morning," I said. "Yes." "The food." "Yes." He considered this. His eyes moved to the empty alcove floor where the basin had been and back to me. "Why?" It was not quite a question. It had the grammar of a question without the rising inflection, as if he was not accustomed to asking and had come to it cautiously, as though the act of asking had required some preparation that I had not been aware of. "Because the kitchen has surplus," I said, "and you're here." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not a diplomatic guest." "No, but you're in my corridor." Another pause. His eyes had not left me. "The others do not bring food." "I expect they don't think of it," I said, which was charitable and probably not entirely accurate, but I didn't think saying the less charitable version served any purpose for either of us. He lowered his head again, slowly, in the way I would come to understand as acknowledgement, not agreement, necessarily, just the registering of a thing said and received. The way you nod at something that you are going to take away and consider rather than something you are going to answer immediately. I went back to my mopping. The next morning he said good morning back. Not loudly, quietly, in the same register as the rest of the corridor sounds, the floor wax settling, the ventilation running its half cycle, the early light beginning its creep under the service bay door. But he said it, which was something. I should say something about what the rest of the staff thought of him, because you cannot understand what came later without understanding the shape of what had preceded it. The resident staff knew who he was, or knew the broad outlines. The Veth Compact's warrior caste did not pass through frontier diplomatic postings in reduced circumstances without a reason that would circulate, and the reason in Koreth's case was not a secret. The tribunal record was part of the session documentation that went to the resident's administrative office before the summit began. Rennet had read it. Rennet had mentioned it to his deputy, who had mentioned it to the senior housekeeping coordinator, who had mentioned it to the morning groundskeeper, who had mentioned it to the afternoon kitchen staff. And by the time I heard the version circulating among the lower service staff, it had been through enough iterations to have acquired some dramatic texture that was probably not in the original document. What remained consistent across all versions was the essential shape of the story. Koreth had been a line commander, his unit had been overrun, his unit had withdrawn, and he had not. The diplomatic staff treated him with the particular brand of deliberate non-acknowledgement that the professionally mannered use in place of cruelty when they want to communicate contempt without exposing themselves to complaint. They looked through him. They gave the alcove a wide berth. In the corridors he was permitted to walk for exercise. They arranged not to be in the same corridor at the same time, which required some coordination that I noticed because I noticed patterns in corridors. The junior attachés occasionally made comments under their breath that I could hear from the far end of the hallway if I was working quietly enough. Nothing that could be quoted, nothing that left a mark. Just the steady, accumulated weight of being treated as though you were not quite there, as though the space you occupied was technically occupied, but not in any sense that mattered. The service staff were less polished about it, which meant they were more direct but also less persistent. They did not walk out of corridors when Koreth entered them. They just didn't speak to him and moved around him when he was in the way and otherwise pretended he wasn't an obstacle worth nodding. The groundskeeper, a man named Detch who had worked the Lower East Block for 22 years and considered it his territory in a way that I respected as a fellow long-tenured staff member, made a point once of commenting to me that whatever the big one had done must have been pretty bad, given the compact's usual standards. I don't know what he did, I said, which was mostly true. I knew the outline. I did not know what it meant. Detch looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided not to have an argument they are fairly certain they would lose. "You're bringing him the kitchen stuff," he said. "I am. Merritt's going to get you in trouble with that eventually. Merritt knows about it." Detch shook his head in the way of someone who has decided that a thing is not their problem, which it wasn't, and went back to his groundskeeping. My supervisor on the Lower East Block, a woman named Wren who had 12 years at Mareth and ran a clean corridor and generally left me alone to run mine, told me in the second week that I should be careful about getting attached. "He's not here for the long term," she said. "Session ends in 6 weeks and whatever they're using him for ends with it, and you don't want Rennet thinking you're making it complicated." "I bring him the surplus," I said. "It's kitchen surplus. Merritt's going to throw it out." "Rennet might not see it that way." "Then Rennet can talk to me about it." Rennet did not talk to me about it for some weeks. Rennet had a great many things to manage in the run-up to a major diplomatic session, and a maid provisioning a disgraced Veth warrior from the kitchen overflow was not, apparently, high enough on the list. I did not push it. I did not bring attention to it. I just continued doing it morning by morning. And the floor got mopped, and the basin got collected, and the days continued. In the 3rd week, Koreth told me his name. I knew it from the placard, but he said it as though it were a thing he was offering rather than a thing I already had, and so I received it that way. "Koreth," he said when I set the basin down one morning, "my name." "I know," I said, "it's on the placard." He glanced at the placard. "You read the Veth script. Number below it in the common tongue." "Ah," he looked at the basin, "you have a name." "Dissa," I said, "Dissavorn." "Dissavorn." He said it carefully, in the way that someone says a word in a language not their own when they want to get the sound of it right rather than just the approximate meaning. You have worked here long. 30 years. That is a long time for a human. It is, I said, though it doesn't feel like it from the inside. It feels like a set of mornings with different weather. He considered that for a moment. The Veth do not think about time the same way, he said. Long service is not a rarity among us. It is expected. A warrior who has served 20 years is at the beginning of a career, not the middle of one. That must make it feel different. Yes, a pause. I had served 14 years when the tribunal convened. He stopped there, as though he had not intended to say that much and was deciding whether the additional exposure was a mistake or simply a fact. I did not ask him to continue. I went back to work. But the next morning he said, I did not run, in the flat, worn smooth way that someone states a fact they have repeated to themselves so often it has lost its urgency. Not asking me to believe him, not pleading for it, just saying it the way you put a stone down in a place you've put it many times before, not expecting the ground to receive it differently. I believed him, not because I had any evidence, not because I had reason to trust his account over a tribunal's, or because I knew anything about military law or compact procedure, or what had actually happened at the Vareth crossing. I believed him because I had been watching him for 3 weeks, and the quality of his stillness had a particular character to it that I had learned to recognize over 30 years of working in close quarters with a great many people, in a great many kinds of difficult situations. It did not have the quality of guilt. It had the quality of something else, the particular exhaustion of a person who has told the truth many times to people who did not intend to believe it, and has had to decide, each time, whether to go on telling it. I had seen that before in 30 years. I knew the difference. I did not say any of this to him. It was not mine to say. I just kept bringing the food and working my corridor and saying good morning, because those were the things I could do, and they were, it seemed to me, not nothing. There was a small dragon in the lower east corridor that I had noticed in the second week, and thought little of at the time. He, I say he, though I was not certain of this, was perhaps the size of a large dog, his scales the color of old pewter, a color that sat easily against the gray of the service corridor walls, and the gray of the floor and the gray of the light at that hour. His wings were folded tightly against his sides in the resting position, and he had positioned himself in the junction between the lower east and the lower north corridors, in the corner where the heating vent ran warm under the tile. He was there most mornings when I began my rounds, and gone by mid-morning when the junior staff came through for the midday clean, and I had not been able to determine when he arrived or when he left, because both events seemed to occur during the gaps in my attention. He was not Veth warrior caste. His build was too slight, his coloring wrong, his manner too quiet and too undemanding. He looked like the kind of dragon that occupied background positions at diplomatic functions, the kind that carried documents and stood near walls, and was never quite in the foreground of anything unless something required them to be, at which point they appeared with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for precisely that requirement. I had seen a dozen like him over the years at various sessions. I said good morning to him too when I passed. He tilted his head at me the first time, in a way that suggested he had not expected to be greeted and was recalibrating his expectations accordingly. After the first week he tilted his head back, which I took as acknowledgement. Wren noticed him in the third week, and assumed he was part of the compact diplomatic party's administrative staff. Someone left their aide in the corridor, she said, more to herself than to me, in the tone of someone who has added a thing to a list of things to inquire about and will probably not actually inquire about it. He's not bothering anyone, I said. No, she agreed, and left it there, because neither of us had the time for a thorough accounting of every small and quiet presence in a building that housed diplomatic sessions. By the fourth week, Kareth was waiting for me. Not obviously. He was always in the alcove when I arrived. He had nowhere else to be before the administrative sessions began at 9, and the alcove was his assigned space. But in the 4th week, there was a quality to his waiting that had changed in a way I noticed without being able to articulate it immediately, and then could articulate clearly once I had looked at it from the right angle. His head was raised when I came around the corner, instead of lowered as it had been in the first weeks. His eyes found me immediately, without the tracking delay of those early mornings. When I set the basin down, he said, "Good morning, de Savorn," before I had the chance to say it first. And on some mornings he talked. Not at length, he was not, by nature or by circumstance, a talkative being, and there were entire mornings that passed with nothing but the essential exchange. But on some mornings something had accrued during the night, some thought or observation or piece of his own history that had found the shape of words by the time I arrived, and he would say it in the same careful, direct way he said everything. He told me about the 4th hatchling he had once been required to present to an imperial review, and how it had bitten the reviewing officer's tail, which was technically an offense against compact protocol, and had resulted in an administrative reprimand for Korath and the hatchling both. He told me about the Areth range as seen from the altitude at which the compact's escort flights traveled it, that the snow line looked completely different from above than from the ground, that there were colors in it that were not visible at ground level, blues and greens in the deep shadow that vanished the moment you began your descent. He told me about a flight he had made once over the drowned territories south of the Varath corridor, where the land had gone under the sea generations ago, and the ruins were still visible in the shallows on a clear day. I told him about 30 years of pre-dawn corridors. I told him about the cat and the warm patch and the particular sadness of finding a favorite sleeping spot empty for the first time. I told him about the composite marble and the cleaning protocol and the chandelier problem, which he found interesting in the way that a person finds interesting a problem they had not previously known existed, and can now add to their understanding of how buildings work. I told him about Merritt's kitchen and the surplus protocols, and the form that nobody used. "She feeds half the building that way," he said, when I had explained it. "She feeds what the building needs," I said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. "Yes," he said after a moment, "there is." He told me about the Varath crossing in pieces over several mornings, in the same flat way he had first said I did not run, not an appeal, not a confession, just an account. His unit had been in a forward position when the engagement turned. The retreat order had come and the unit had withdrawn. He had not withdrawn because there were 4 wounded who could not be moved, and the retreat route's geometry did not accommodate litters in the time frame the order allowed. He had stayed with them for 11 days. He described 11 days in a way that was neither dramatic nor sanitized. He described the logistics of it, how he had managed water, how he had managed the cover rotation, how he had managed the particular problem of keeping 4 wounded soldiers alive in a forward position that was not designed for sustained occupation. He described it practically, the way a person describes a problem they solved, noting the solutions that had worked and the ones that had not, and what he had done differently when the first approach failed. And only at the edges of the description was there any indication of what 11 days had actually cost in ways that were not logistical, a pause in a particular place, a sentence that came out shorter than the ones around it, the way he did not describe the nights. The 4 had survived. The tribunal had found that their survival did not change the fact of his failure to withdraw with the unit, because the standing order was the standing order. An individual judgment in a field engagement was not a recognized defense under compact military code, regardless of outcome. He said all of this without bitterness. He said it the way you recite something you have fully examined and come to understand, and have not yet been able to stop turning over anyway. "The 4 who survived," I said one morning after he had told me the last of it, "do you know where they are?" 3 returned to service," he said. "1 died of his injuries 2 years after the crossing. He had a mate and 2 hatchlings. His family received the compact's full honor support provision. It is extensive. But he's still gone. Yes, a pause that had a different texture from his ordinary pauses. He is still gone. I finished the far end of the corridor. On my way back I said, "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. I have thought sometimes that it might have been the wrong thing done for the right reason, that the standing order exists because individual judgments in field engagements are unreliable, that the tribunal was not wrong by the measure of the code. But you do it again. The pause this time was longer. He looked at the floor of the alcove. "Yes," he said. "Then it was the right thing." He lowered his head in the slow way that meant the thing had been received. I went back to my trolley and continued the pass. I was summoned to Rennett's office in the 5th week. It was not unexpected. Rennett was a small, careful man who had run the Marith diplomatic residence for 9 years and kept it running well, which required a set of skills that I respected even when I disagreed with their application. He had a way of sitting behind his desk that made him look larger than he was, and a way of beginning conversations that established precisely the relationship he intended them to have before the first substantive sentence had been spoken. He did not waste time. "The Veth administrative attaché has mentioned that you've been providing the warrior designate in the Lower East with kitchen provisioning." "Kitchen surplus," I said. "Merritt was going to discard it." "That's not really the point, Dissat." "What is the point?" He looked at me. "The warrior designate is here in an administrative capacity. He is not a diplomatic guest. He is not a member of the Compact's summit delegation. He has a specific status under the Compact's own placement terms, and that status, I'll be straightforward, is not one that the Compact's delegation particularly wants highlighted." "You're saying it's embarrassing for them." "I'm saying that drawing attention to his presence in whatever form is not in the residence's interest during a session at this level." He paused. "You are a valued member of the staff. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm asking you to be considered." I thought about what I was going to say for a moment. "He's in my corridor," I said. "I clean it. I say good morning when I pass. That's going to continue regardless because it's my job and it's courtesy. The food, I can stop that if you tell me to stop it." Rennett looked at me for a long moment. I could see him making the calculation that all residence directors eventually have to make when they encounter a member of the long-tenured service staff who has decided that a thing is right, whether the diplomatic cost of overruling is higher than the diplomatic cost of permitting. In my experience, it usually was, if you waited long enough and said the next thing quietly. "The corridor is fine," he said. "The food, just keep it quiet, don't make it a thing." "I never made it a thing," I said. He nodded once, in the way that meant the conversation was finished, and he was already moving on to the next item on his list. "That's all," he said. I went back to my corridor. The war sovereign of the Veth Compact arrived on the 3rd day of the 6th week, which was the 4th week of the summit proper. He was not on the official schedule. That was the first notable thing. The second notable thing was that his transport, a sovereign-class vessel of the kind that made the Marith Spaceport's tower personnel extremely careful about their clearance verification for approximately 40 minutes before they finished, did not land at the diplomatic bay where all the other session delegates had arrived. It landed at the freight bay on the far end of the facility, which was technically within the residence's operational footprint, and therefore technically permissible, which also meant that nobody in the residence's administrative office was entirely certain how to react or what protocol governed the situation, and that uncertainty had produced, in Rennett, the contained and very particular energy of a man who is managing a problem he did not know he would have to manage, and is doing it with professional composure while internally recalibrating everything. I could read that energy from the lobby as I came in from my second corridor pass. I did not know the specifics yet. I knew that something had arrived that the building was not prepared for. I did not go to the lobby. I went back to the lower east corridor and started on the final pass of the morning. Korath was in the alcove. His head was raised, not in the waiting way, in a different way. Alert, in the specific manner of a trained soldier's alertness, the kind that is not about threat assessment but about information. His nostrils were moving slightly in the way that I had noticed sometimes when something was traveling down the ventilation ducts from elsewhere in the building. "Something is happening," he said. "In the main building," I said. "I don't know what yet." He was quiet, then carefully, "I know what the transport looks like." I set down my mop. "The sovereigns." "Yes." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the amber eyes that had been watching me since the first morning, and in them there was something that I can only describe as a person standing very still at the edge of a thing they cannot see the bottom of. Not fear. Something more measured than fear and more complicated. "All right," I said. "Whatever happens, you'll know soon enough. Right now the floor needs doing." He watched me for a moment. Then a sound came out of him that I had not heard before, low, resonant, somewhere in the chest, below the register of words. I had the impression that it was some kind of acknowledgement for the specific normalcy of what I had just said. I did not remark on it. I picked up my mop and did the corridor. I was on the far pass, near the junction with the lower north, when I heard footsteps coming from the north stair. Not the sound of resident staff, which I knew by rhythm and weight after 30 years. These were slower, deliberate, heavy in a way that was different from the ordinary weights that moved through service corridors. The sound of something large walking at the pace it chose to walk at, rather than the pace the space suggested. I straightened. He came around the corner of the lower north junction and stopped. The war sovereign of the Veth Compact was not what I had expected, which was already a failure of expectation on my part, because I had not particularly expected anything. He was old in the way that ancient things are old, not decrepit, not frail, but carrying the weight of a great deal of time in the way his scales had settled along his frame, deep charcoal over weathered gold at the ridges. The spinal crest worn smooth rather than sharp in the way that very old things go smooth, their sharpness not lost but integrated. He was perhaps taller at the shoulder than Korath, broader in the chest, but the difference was not the overwhelming difference I might have imagined. What was different was his presence, the quality of stillness he carried, the way the corridor seemed to recalibrate its own proportions slightly around him when he entered it, the way that things that had seemed like ordinary distances between me and the wall and the trolley and the floor suddenly seemed like they had been measured against a different scale. He looked at me. I was holding a mop. I was wearing the lined house uniform with the Marith crest on the left breast. I was 56 years old, and I had been on my feet since 5 in the morning, and I imagine I looked exactly like what I was. "De Savorn," he said. His voice was very deep and very calm, in the way that deep water is calm, not placid, but settled over a great deal that was not visible from the surface. "Yes," I said. "I am Veth Sarith," he said, "war sovereign of the Compact." He paused. "I know your name because my honor watcher has been in your corridor for 4 weeks. I looked at the junction between the corridors. The pewter-scaled dragon was there, in his usual corner near the warm vent, very still, watching, as he had been watching all along. "I thought he was an administrative aide," I said. "He is, among other things," the sovereign said. "He is also my eyes. He has been my eyes here." I held my mop. "What were you looking for?" The sovereign came forward, unhurried, until he was standing in the corridor proper. He glanced toward the lower east alcove, where I had no doubt Korath had been listening to every word since the first footsteps on the north stair. Then he looked back at me. "I will tell you what happened at the Varath crossing," he said, "and then I will tell you what I was looking for." He told me the parts I did not know. He had known about the 4 wounded before the tribunal convened. He had known because the honor watcher assigned to Koreth's unit, not this one, a different one, placed there for reasons the sovereign described only as his own standard practice regarding field commanders in disputed territories, had been at the Vareth crossing for the 11 days, had watched, had filed his account to the sovereign directly, as honor watcher accounts were filed, in the immediate aftermath. The account was clear. Koreth had not run, Koreth had stayed. The 4 who had survived because Koreth had stayed. The tribunal had not had access to the honor watcher's account. Not because the sovereign had withheld it from the proceedings through concealment. Because under compact law, honor watcher accounts are sovereign intelligence. They cannot be compelled into tribunal proceedings without the war sovereign's direct and formal release, which is a protection built into the watcher system precisely because the watchers are placed by the sovereign's authority and their accounts are considered extensions of his eyes. And the war sovereign at the time of the tribunal had not released the account. He said this without apology or evasion, in the same deep, settled tone. He had not released the account because he had wanted to see what happened next. I looked at him. You let a man be convicted of cowardice to see what happened next? Yes. That seems cruel. It was, he said. I knew it was when I made the choice. I want to be honest with you about that. I thought about Koreth, saying I did not run in the flat, worn smooth voice of someone who has said the truth so many times to people who did not intend to believe it that the truth has lost its texture. 5 years of that. 5 years of carrying the account and putting it down in front of people and watching them decide it was not sufficient. What were you looking for? I said. My voice came out harder than I had intended it to, and I did not adjust it. The sovereign did not flinch from the hardness. I was looking for whether Koreth was worth the thing I intended to do for him, he said. The reinstatement, a war sovereign's reinstatement over the objection of a formal tribunal. That is not a small act under compact law. It creates fractures in the framework. It sets precedent that others will use and misuse. I needed to know not whether he had done the right thing at the Vareth crossing because I already knew that. I knew from the honor watcher's account 5 years ago, before the tribunal had even convened. I needed to know what those 5 years had made of him. I waited. A warrior who has been through what Koreth has been through, the sovereign said carefully, can come out of it many ways, embittered, broken, angry in ways that turn inward or outward and make them into something they were not before, or unchanged in the ways that matter, not unmarked, not untouched, but still the person the Vareth crossing was made of. He paused. The only reliable measure I know of how a person has come through a thing is how they treat those who cannot do anything for them. The corridor was very quiet. I cannot do anything for him, I said. No, you are a hall maid in a frontier diplomatic residence. You have no standing in the compact, no access to the tribunal record, no ability to restore his rank or his honor or anything that was taken from him. You brought him kitchen surplus every morning because it would otherwise have been discarded. You said good morning when you passed. You cleaned around him without making him feel like an obstacle or an embarrassment. You talked to him when he talked. You told him when he told you his account that you believed he had done the right thing. The sovereign held my eyes. He has not been told that by anyone else in 5 years. I did not say anything. You gave him the measure of a person, the sovereign said, without knowing what it cost him that he had been denied it. That is what I was looking for. Not in him, in the ones around him. Because the only way I know to see who a person truly is, when everything they were has been taken away and they have nothing left to perform, is to watch how they are treated by people who have nothing to gain from treating them well. You had nothing to gain, and you gave him what he was due. He glanced toward the lower east alcove again. Koreth, he said, come out. There was a pause. Then the sound of Koreth rising from the alcove floor, the slight drag of the scarred wing, the careful movement of something large in a space built for smaller things, and he came around the corner of the junction and stopped. He was looking at the sovereign was looking at him. The honor watcher's account will be released to the tribunal office this afternoon, the sovereign said. The reinstatement order will follow. By tomorrow morning, your rank is restored in full. Your record will be corrected. The Vareth crossing will be documented as it happened, and what you did there will be named for what it was. Korath was very still. I should have done this 5 years ago, the sovereign said. I have already written this in the reinstatement record. I am saying it now because the record is not the same as saying it to your face. He paused. I am sorry for the 5 years. I watched Korath receive this. It is hard to describe what I saw, because what I saw was not dramatic in the way that scenes of this kind are sometimes described as dramatic. He did not weep. He did not surge forward or step back. He stood in the lower east service corridor with his scarred wing slightly wrong and his dark copper-gray scales in the morning light from the service bay window. And something went out of him that had been there since the first morning I had come around the corner and found him in the alcove. A quality of sustained bracing. Like a structure that has been holding weight for so long it has forgotten. There was a time before the weight was on it. I watched it leave him, and I watched what was underneath it, which was simply a person. A soldier who had stayed with the wounded because that was who he was, and had been waiting for 5 years to be seen as that person again. "Thank you," he said to the sovereign. The sovereign inclined his head, then he looked at me. "Dissavorn," he said. "The Veth Compact observes the honor of the tending hand, a formal mark given to those who keep a person's worth when others have set it down." He paused. "We would formally register you to this honor." I thought about this. What does that mean in practice? Your name is entered in the Compact's permanent record with an account of what you did. A mark, small, given in a brief ceremony, is placed on your forearm. You are formally recognized as a keeper of worth in the Compact's standing. It carries no obligations and no requirements. It is simply the record. I looked down at my hands, which were still on the handle of my mop. I thought about the form and the counter-signature and Merritt sliding the basin across the kitchen counter. I looked back up at the sovereign. "I appreciate it," I said. "I mean that. But I brought him kitchen surplus and said good morning. I'm not certain it requires a ceremony." The sovereign looked at me for a moment. Something happened in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the near territory of one. "The honor watcher," he said, "reported that when your director suggested you might want to be more careful, you said the corridor was your job and courtesy was courtesy." "I did say that." "Yes." The sovereign's tone had the quality of someone who has had a thing confirmed that they had already believed. "The record. Then, without the ceremony if you prefer, your name in the permanent account." "All right," I said, "that seems fair." He inclined his head. Then he looked at Korath, and between them passed the kind of communication that does not require words. Two people who have known each other a long time and have a great deal to say that will not be said in a service corridor, because some things require more space than a service corridor provides. The sovereign turned and went back the way he had come, the honor watcher falling in at his flank from the corner where he had been sitting all along, and the corridor was quiet. Korath and I stood in the lower east service corridor in the morning light. "Well," I said after a moment. "Yes," he said. I looked at the floor. It was not quite finished. "I should do the end of the pass," I said. "I should go to the administrative office," he said. "There will be documentation." "There will," I agreed. We stood there for another moment. "Dissavorn," he said. "Korath," I said. He moved away down the corridor toward the north stair. I went back to the end of the pass. The floor needed doing, and I did it. The summit ended on a Friday. The diplomatic parties cleared their suites, and the residence returned to its between-session routine over the course of a weekend. And by Monday morning, the upper floors had been stripped and reset, and the lower east service corridor was empty. The alcove was just an alcove again. The placard had been removed. There was a rectangle of slightly cleaner wall where it had been, which I would need to address eventually, and the floor of the alcove had a different texture to it from the sustained weight of something very large sitting in the same position for several weeks. A faint compression in the old stone's finish that would require some attention. I brought my trolley around the corner at 20 minutes past 5 on that first Monday, and stood in front of the empty alcove for a moment. Then I went to work, because it was still my corridor and the corridor still needed doing. I found the mark at the end of the pass, when I was working the doorframe of the service bay, the one that opened onto the small courtyard that caught the morning light, and held it for perhaps 20 minutes before it moved on. It was carved into the wood at approximately the height where a large being might rest its head if it were sitting in the alcove and turned toward the door. A single mark, no larger than my palm, worked carefully into the grain of the wood with attention to the line of it, the depth of it, the evenness of the cuts. Not gouged. Carved in the way that something is carved when time and care have been given to it over more than one sitting. I crouched down and looked at it closely. I had already sent a transcription of it to Paris, my friend who had worked the Compact's Areth embassy for 6 years, by the time I finished my shift. She wrote back at noon. "The mark is the Veth sign for this place kept me," she wrote. "It's given by members of the Compact to places or people that sustain them in reduced circumstances. Not ceremonially," she had emphasized this literally. "It's the formal statement that this place or this person was the measure that held when others did not. Considered extremely serious in the Compact's internal language. Not an expression. A fact." I read her message twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and finished my lunch. That evening, on my way out, I stopped at the service bay door and crouched down and looked at the mark again. I traced it with the tip of one finger, following the line of it, the curve of the first stroke, the clean angle of the second, the final mark that closed the form. This place kept me. I stood up, I put on my coat, I went home. The Compact's formal notification arrived 3 weeks later, a single page in the common tongue, signed with the sovereign seal, confirming my registration to the honor of the tending hand, and noting that the account of what I had done was now part of the permanent record of Veth Compact Session 14. I put it in the drawer where I keep documents I do not need often but do not wish to lose. Some months after that I received a brief message from an administrative address I did not recognize. It said only, the fourth was Death Kara. He had a mate and 2 hatchlings. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about a soldier who had stayed 11 days for 4 people, one of whom had gone home and died 2 years later anyway, his family provided for, his name carried. I thought about the particular weight of knowing that name. I thought about Koreth deciding, at some point after the summit and the reinstatement and the return to whatever came next, that I should have it. I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me." I do not know if that was the right thing, but it seemed like the thing to say, and I have found over 30 years that the thing that seems right in the moment, said plainly and without embellishment, is usually close enough. Sometimes it is all that is needed. Sometimes it is more than the person expected, and you don't know that until much later, if you know it at all. The mark is still on the doorframe. I expect it will remain there for some time. The residence director noticed it eventually, noticed it, looked at me with the expression of a man deciding how much he wants to know about something, and then walked away without saying anything, which I thought was probably the right decision on his part and gave him credit for it. I still work the lower east corridor, 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, 32 years now. The floor takes the same time to dry in cold weather as it always has. The window still gets the good morning light.